Hello and welcome to the Geopolitics Explained podcast, episode 2. This has been recorded on the 15th of February 2023. Thank you to everyone who listened to the first episode, all about Russia. I really appreciate it. It was received very well, and that makes it a lot easier to do these episodes, so thank you for that. I was thinking, how can we top the first episode? Of course, Russia's a very exciting topic in geopolitics, and I thought the only way to top an episode about Russia is to talk about China. So that's what we're going to do today. I have a hell of a lot of notes. It might go very long. I mean, the Russia one was quite long, but this could go even longer. So let's get into it. Now, China has an incredibly deep history that is well documented, even in basic research that you can find anywhere on the internet. So I'm going to start, just like I did with Russia, but in a hell of a lot more detail, going through China's history and how they got to the point that they're at today. If it seems like I'm slightly rushing through a lot of years in history, it's kind of because I am. There is so much to talk about with Chinese history, so there might be things that you think, hey Dylan, you should talk about that, but if I did talk about it, I'd be here for hours, so I'm going to have to miss it out. So we start in 2100 BC to 1600 BC, where the Xia dynasty was the leading power in China. They were credited with bringing the Bronze Age to Asia. After that, we have the Shang dynasty, which ruled China for about 500 years until 1046 BC. We then found ourselves under the Zhou dynasty. Now, I've spoke about periods of tension before when empires come to an end. So the Shang dynasty led for a long period of time, and after this, in the period of the Zhou dynasty, there was a period of tension. So the Zhou dynasty lasted from 1046 BC to 221 BC, and it can be split into 3 different parts. So the first part, which was called Western Zhou, that was actually a period of relative peace. But the periods after, the Spring and Autumn period, and the Warring States period, I mean, I think the name kind of tells you the story. There was a lot of division and war. At the end of this period, the Zhou dynasty, it was the Qin dynasty that emerged as the ruling power. Now, after the period of tension and war under the Zhou dynasty, just like we saw at the end of World War II, there was massive levels of innovation in a short amount of time. So the Qin dynasty established the one emperor system that we still see China operate under today. The Great Wall of China was built, the Terracotta Army was established, and the emperor created standardized units of weight and measurement and the writing system. Now, that sounds like a lot, but the fascinating thing about this is that all this occurred in 15 years, which makes the Qin dynasty one of the most productive dynasties in Chinese history. The dynasty that came after the Qin dynasty was the Han dynasty. Also another very interesting period in Chinese leadership, because the Han dynasty ruled China at the same time that the Roman Empire ruled Europe and the other surrounding areas. This period in Chinese history saw the beginning of the Silk Road, where trade was established from China all the way through Central Asia towards Europe. We still see the Silk Road discussed today. Its similarities to the Belt and Road Initiative, and I have a book on my bookshelf right now that some people might have heard of called The Digital Silk Road, which describes how China is using technology to, in a similar way to what they did back in the period of the Han Dynasty, spread their trade and their power. the Han Dynasty saw the turn from BC to AD during its rule. So it existed from 206 BC to 220 AD. After the Han Dynasty, we saw another period of change and fracturing under the Wei, Jin, Northern and Southern dynasties. This happened from 220 to the year 581. After this was the Sui dynasty from 581 to 618. Again, a relatively short period, but it saw the rebuilding of the Great Wall of China. And it was also the first noted time that Japan sent emissaries over to China to study the culture, the economics and the politics, and this massively influenced Japanese culture in ways that is still seen today. After the Sui dynasty, we had the Tang dynasty. This is deemed one of the most powerful periods in Chinese history, and if we look at China today, this is probably one of the periods that they'll get the most inspiration from as they want to return to the stage of being a global power. So, like I've said, when empires fall, after the period of tension, there is a period of stability where innovation can occur. The Sui dynasty acted as that period of calm and stability, and then once the Tang dynasty took over, it kind of set a base level for the innovation to take off. We saw the only female emperor in Chinese history during this period. We saw poetry, painting and pottery develop. Korea and Japan sent further students to study China. And the status of women was improved as they were free to marry and divorce. Now, I talk about empires falling a lot because I feel like we're in a period where we could see the US empire fall or we could see it continue. It all depends how countries interact with each other. This period of the Tang dynasty saw one of the first classic falls of an empire in ways that Ray Dalio describes in his books, especially the one about the changing world order. So, the Tang dynasty experienced economic values and wealth gaps amongst the people. This led to people looking at the government in an unfavourable light. An internal conflict arose. All this, coupled with poor finances, lead to an empire declining. The Tang dynasty ended in the year 907, and between 907 and the lead of the next dynasty, which was the Song dynasty, there was, of course, you guessed it, a period of tension. Now, in the year 960, the Song dynasty came to power. They were in power until 1279. This period saw a lot of military tech advance, and China developed its overseas trade through building ships. It also saw the first recorded use of paper money in China during this period. After the Song dynasty came the Yuan dynasty that existed for about 100 years. This was a very interesting dynasty because it was the first foreign-controlled dynasty when Kublai Khan from Mongolia came over the border and took control of China. Trade and connectivity with surrounding areas continued to grow, and this allowed innovation to continue to grow. But how the Yuan dynasty went about this was through expensive wars, because they wanted to maintain the territory that they had and take more. So the fall of the Yuan dynasty was ultimately caused by this, as they wanted further territory in Japan, Vietnam and Burma that they ultimately couldn't get. After the Yuan dynasty came the Ming dynasty, which existed from 1368 to 1644. It saw the building of the Great Wall of China that we still see in the present day, because after the Mongol Empire fled, who ruled China during the Yuan dynasty, they needed a blockade to attempt to keep the Mongols in their own land, which is why the Great Wall was built again and established into the wall that we see today. Ocean trade and shipping expanded even further during this period, and the country attempted to pivot from an agriculture-based society to an industrial one. Now, you'll see this trend throughout this podcast. Like I said, most countries have a geopolitical goal, such as Russia's is to maintain distance between its borders and its capital. It's not exactly China's goal, but one of the main reasons that Chinese empires fall in history has been because of food and energy. Now, China has usually had a large population, and its land isn't particularly good enough to provide enough food for that population. Also, because they were innovating so quickly, they often didn't have enough energy to provide for that level of innovation. This leads to Chinese empires falling, and it's one of the biggest issues with present-day China. Now, I'll discuss this later as to why I think this won't lead to a Chinese downfall this time, but in the past it has, and it's probably something that they're quite heavily aware of in present-day Chinese leadership. There are more reasons why I think it won't happen again, but there's a little sneak peek for later. Okay, so the Ming Dynasty, as I said, led from 1368 to 1644. After this came the Qing Dynasty. The Qing Dynasty existed from 1644 all the way to 1912, so very recent in the grand scheme of things. The Qing Dynasty experienced a rapid downfall when the European powers caught up with China. Now, I'd say this occurred because of connectivity. The world got smaller, countries were more connected because technology had advanced so much. I mean, you look now at how quick we can get around the world. You can get anywhere in the world in a day, and that connectivity is going to continue to grow and develop. This is one of the things I'm going to talk about in my Trends of Geopolitics writing. That if you go onto my Substack and look at every piece that comes out on a Thursday, you can see how those all connect. I've currently been talking about game theory, currently in mathematics, but that's going to come back round to how it all connects and is relevant to geopolitics. And connectivity will be another one of those sections. But for now, we'll go back to talking about China. So, when the European powers arrived in China, they were stronger militarily than the Chinese military. And the Europeans wanted resources that the Chinese had. Now, the Chinese looked at the Europeans and what they had to offer, and they weren't particularly impressed. The Europeans had nothing that the Chinese wanted. So, specifically the Brits introduced opium into China, and this led to the Opium Wars. China got hooked on opium. The Brits and other European powers then had something that the Chinese wanted. A series of physical wars occurred during the period of the Opium Wars, and the British Navy defeated China and took Hong Kong and other Chinese ports, so they could access these ports for trade. While the British were taking Chinese territory, Chinese weakness was also exploited by Russia and Japan, who challenged China from the north. So China lost further territory to both of these countries. As I've spoke about the history of Chinese dynasties and ruling empires, it sounds like an incredibly strong history, with periods of tension coupled in between. But there was always a strong leading power in China. This was such a different period and a difficult time in Chinese history because it was one of the first times in Chinese history that they'd been challenged by an outside power. I said when I started talking about this section, the Qing dynasty ended in 1912, which in the grand scheme of things wasn't that long ago. I'm really quite interested in geopolitical memory and how long countries remember specific things. All countries act in self-interest for themselves, even if it doesn't seem like that. They always do. China might be making many alliances in present day, and they seem to be one of the most connected countries in the world. But I always question how long Chinese geopolitical memory really is. And if they grow in power more and more, will some of the countries that maybe took advantage of Chinese weakness, will they be punished in some way? Not a prediction, but a very interesting thought, and geopolitical memory of different countries really interests me as a concept. So, let's get back to the history. The Qing dynasty was a tough period in Chinese history. After 1912 and until 1949, China was led by the Republic of China, the ROC. This period contained both world wars. During World War I, China was neutral at the start in 1914, but they ended this in 1917 when they declared war on Germany and Austro-Hungary. They didn't send combat troops, but they sent labourers who massively supported the British and the French armies in defeating the German and the Austro-Hungarians. But China still wasn't seen as a great power. At the Paris Peace Conference, China was given 2 seats. They wanted the Shandong Peninsula back, which had belonged to Germany in 1914, but then it was occupied by Japan. During this period, Japan was the Asian regional superpower. So they had influence over China. While China was neutral in 1914, they agreed to Japan's 21 demands. Now, one of the demands was that Japan would control any former German territory if it was lost, rather than that territory being returned to China. So China agreed to these 21 demands in 1914 while they were under a period of neutrality. And they did this because they knew the Japanese were a lot stronger than they were, and they knew that they'd be militarily overrun. This also helped to buy China time. But the war with Japan did eventually come. In 1931, the Japanese army invaded Manchuria, which is a resource-rich area in the northeast region of China. Now, Japan took this area and installed a puppet government. So tensions had begun to rise again between Japan and China. The First Sino-Japanese War occurred in 1894 to 1895, which I'm not going to discuss here, but the second one broke out in 1937. It was caused by a Japanese soldier who failed to return to base after a training exercise, and in a nearby town in China, they didn't let the Japanese troops search for this missing guard, and this standoff became violent. So Japan very quickly claimed Beijing and Shanghai before November in 1937. And in December of 1937, the Japanese massacred between 200,000 and 300,000 people in Nanjing. It looked like China was going to get completely rolled over by Japan, but the war hit a stalemate and countries provided foreign aid to China. A lot of these countries saw Japan growing in power, specifically the United States, and they saw that Japan could, in the end, reach a stage where they could potentially rival the US on the world power stage. The US actually halted trade of aircraft oil and scrap metal to Japan, and this was in a period where Japan received around 80% of their oil from the US. So this trade embargo was deemed one of the reasons why Japan decided to attack Pearl Harbor, which ultimately ended up dragging the US into World War II and led to Japanese defeat. I think this demonstrates the importance of China in World War II in defending against the Japanese for so long. China is quite resource rich, and if the Japanese would have completely taken China, they would have had access to all these resources. They would have been a lot harder to beat, and they could have challenged the global powers a lot earlier than they did. And they would have been a lot stronger if they would have done. So even though China isn't particularly discussed heavily as a key member of the Allies during World War II, I think this proves just how important they really were. So, after World War II, the two systems that emerged victorious were the Soviet Union's communist system and the United States capitalist system. Now, one of the places where it was clear that there was a fight for control between these two systems was in China, who after World War II experienced a civil war. The People's Republic of China were the ones pushing for a communist system, whereas the Republic of China, who existed before the end of World War II, were vying for a capitalist system. Now, as we know, the PRC did win this civil war, and so China was aligned with the communist Soviet Union. In 1950, they signed the Treaty of Friendship, Alliance and Mutual Assistance with the Soviet Union, and the leader that this all happened under was Mao. Now, the ROC didn't cease to exist after the Civil War. They fled to Taiwan, which is what causes the entire tensions between China and Taiwan. It's the fact that the PRC took control of mainland China in 1949, but the party who opposed them, who wanted to run China under a capitalist system, the ROC, they fled to an island not particularly far off China's main coast. Another element of this is that China lost a lot of its territory during what is called the Century of Humiliation that I discussed earlier under the Qing Dynasty. But they've regained a lot of this, so they got Hong Kong back in 1997 from the British, and Macau was returned from Portugal to China in 1999. But they lost Taiwan to the Japanese, who ruled it until 1945, and then they also lost it when the ROC fled mainland China to Taiwan. This is one of the only territories that China hasn't received back from its period of relative weakness. So it doesn't surprise me that tensions are so high in China regarding Taiwan, especially when it's situated so close to the Chinese mainland. Now, under Mao's leadership, China experienced the Great Leap Forward, which occurred between 1958 and 1962. The cause of the Great Leap Forward was China attempting to copy the Soviet Union's model to industrialise away from an agricultural-based society. Now, I remember mentioning that about 10 minutes ago, and how it led to the fall of that Chinese empire. This time it didn't lead to the fall of that Chinese empire. There was nobody who was strong enough who wanted to influence China negatively. The Russians didn't, because China and Russia were aligned. So it didn't lead to Mao's rule ending, but it did lead to a massive famine and the loss of millions of people. The number is debated, but it was millions of people. Now, we're still under the period of Mao's leadership. So after the Great Leap Forward, Mao had a little bit of an epiphany, shall we say. And he realised that the biggest threat to China was the Soviet Union, and so he distanced from them quite heavily. His principle here was to identify a country's main enemy, neutralise any of that country's allies, and draw them away from this country. And Mao deemed that Russia was this main enemy, or the Soviet Union at the time. But China had maintained an average rate of 6% growth of the economy per year when they were aligned closely with Russia. And they weren't quite ready to go it alone yet. So this led to the Chinese pivoting towards the US. And they still maintained their average rate of 6% per annum growth under Mao's rule. One element of this Chinese pivot to the US was in 1971, the PRC of China was given a seat on the United Nations Security Council. Now, before this, it had been held by the ROC, but the ROC was just expelled from the United Nations completely. This showed at the time the strength of picking the right friends, and how the Chinese pivot to the US ultimately allowed them to flourish and grow into the Chinese power that we see today. Now, of course, geopolitical alliances aren't permanent. As I've said, countries act in self-interest, but it was definitely in China's and the United States' self-interest for them to align together. I just think the United States spotted that China had sown the seeds for its rise as a global superpower a little bit too late. When China, specifically the PRC, joined the UN Security Council, this led to the Shanghai Communique. I hope that's how you say it. Now, this detailed that the US acknowledges that there is one China and that Taiwan is part of China. This causes so much tension in the China-Taiwan crisis because now the US are a geopolitical enemy of China. They've had to go back on that comment, which doesn't paint them in a great light. After the period under Mao's leadership, we saw China ruled under Deng, Jiang, and Hu Jintao, who until recently was still a part of Chinese politics. That is until he was escorted out of the last Chinese Communist Party conference. But I'll discuss more about this in a few minutes. So, under these three leaders, poverty fell rapidly. So, before, 90% of the population were in poverty, and it fell to less than half during the leadership of these three. Now, in present day, less than 1% of the Chinese population lives in poverty. So it really established that trend towards a more developed society. During this period before Xi Jinping's leadership, we saw the Asian financial crisis. Now, China was quite moderately unaffected by the Asian financial crisis. They were still deemed quite a populist country, and so they weren't represented massively in world indexes or Asia indexes, such as the MSCI Asia Index. This meant that they didn't experience the rapid capital inflows, which then, when rapid capital outflow came, led to the problems that occurred in nations such as Thailand and the Philippines and led to currency devaluations. China did have to restructure debt and corporations that did suffer in the crisis, but they sold the unprofitable state-owned companies. They built up reserves in dollars that were used to support their currency, and so they didn't have to devalue. In 2001 is when China really joined the world, especially in aspects of trade, when they joined the World Trade Organization. Now, this is attributed to the time when globalization really accelerated. China is a massive player in import and export of various goods, contributed to this. And they provided cheap labour for Western countries to export to, which is why whenever you see on any product, now if you look on the label, many products say made in China or made in Bangladesh, for example. That was because it was cheaper to export labour to these countries because the labour is cheaper over there. Now, it remains to be seen if this trend will continue. China is actually now quite an expensive place for labour, and India is pegged to be one of the places that could replace it. So we're going to fast forward to 2012, which is when Xi Jinping came into power. Now, China was growing in global influence and power, especially through their trade, but this wasn't particularly being addressed yet in geopolitics by rival powers, specifically the US. Since this time, however, we saw under Donald Trump when the trade war started and US and Chinese relations have slowly disintegrated over this period. Now, Xi has ended up becoming one of the most powerful Chinese leaders since Mao. This is what I was referring to when I spoke about the removal of Hu Jintao during the last Chinese Communist Party conference. Because Hu Jintao was a former ruler of China, Xi Jinping didn't want any potential challenges to his rule. It's not known why Hu Jintao was removed, but since Xi Jinping came into power in 2012, he's been trying to remove any potential challenges to his rule, and he now seems to have addressed that. The Politburo that surrounds him, which is the leadership level below Xi Jinping, contains 7 people, is now full of men who completely support Xi Jinping. So there is very little challenge to his rule. He's currently in his 3rd term, when before Xi's current election, most rulers only had 2 terms. So it seems that Xi is trying to establish himself as leader for life. Now, one of my favourite things to talk about in geopolitics is connectivity. How states are connected to each other through trade, through borders, through diplomacy, through summits and other partnerships, and if these connections are growing or declining. Now, through the Belt and Road Initiative, China is very well connected. They're also massive players in import and export markets. So this naturally leads to China being one of the most connected countries in the world. Now, before the geopolitical rivalry between the US and China emerged, they were very well connected. But now, China and the US seem to be distancing themselves from each other, and relations are getting colder. So if China is connecting less with the US, who will it be connecting with? And as the US and China trade less and less, can every country afford not to trade with China? So, in other words, is a country self-sufficient enough in commodities that China is a key player in? Now, the US is quite self-sufficient in many aspects, mainly because of the amount of land that they have, and their population is relatively small in comparison to the amount of land that they actually have. But you look at other countries, for example, the UK, where I'm from, there isn't enough land that can grow food to feed the entire population. Now, this is what I mean when it comes to self-sufficiency, but there's so many other aspects outside of just food. There's energy, there's semiconductors, there's materials that are used to build other elements of infrastructure. This all needs to be considered, and if countries can afford to completely isolate China and not trade with them at all. So, back to Chinese connectivity. There's a lot of ways that China are trying to boost this connectivity, especially through the Belt and Road Initiative, but also through other strategies. So, one of China's key areas of influence is the South China Sea and the Pacific Islands. This area that China wants to influence stretches as far down to Australia, which I saw an interesting statistic about this particular topic a few weeks ago. China wants to influence the area all the way down to Australia. The distance between China and Australia, the northern coast, is the same distance from Beijing to Warsaw, which is in Poland. Now, if you look on a world map, it doesn't look like that. But that shows the massive area that China wants to have influence over in the Pacific. Now, to expand this influence, China is actually building islands in the Pacific from scratch and putting bases on these islands. This will provide them with areas further away from their own mainland in which they can spread influence. This puts Australia in a tough position. Australia is a member of AUKUS, a group containing the UK and the US also, and both the UK and the US have agreed to help Australia build nuclear submarines. But Australia is also a key trading partner with China. This is a tough line that they have to walk along very carefully if they want to maintain relations with the Western group containing the UK and the US and other nations, but also if they still want access to Chinese markets. Another key area for China is Africa. Now, China a few years ago built its first military base outside of its own country, and they built this in Djibouti. This allows them to have a foothold in Africa in efforts to keep the peace. Now, this seems to have paid off, as we've seen 46 African countries sign up for China's Belt and Road Initiative. Africa is modernising and industrialising in some areas, and if it isn't yet, it will be, as human innovation and technology always seems to advance. Apart from periods of tension and war, when it actually declines, I think that's specifically a threat for the developed world, and states and areas such as Africa would catch up during this point. And if this doesn't happen in the next few decades, it's bound to happen in the next century. Now, if Africa is modernising and industrialising, just like we saw when the developed world industrialised, that brought rapid growth to these areas. With China having an influence in Africa, it can benefit from the growth that Africa experiences when it finally experiences it. Now, when I discussed with Russia during that episode, and we said that one of Russia's main goals is to plug access points into its country. Now, China doesn't have this problem, or it doesn't particularly focus on this problem. China is expanding its borders, not its political borders, but its functional borders, through its Belt and Road Initiative. So what do I mean by this? If China can access these areas through trade, it can build infrastructure in these areas, it can have a hand in what occurs in these areas, it can influence these countries through the income that these countries get through trade, through the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, this relies on the Belt and Road Initiative being a success, but with so many countries signed on, there are a lot of countries that would also benefit from its success. Now, going back to main geopolitical theories, by this I mean who rules the world order. Now, we have Sir Halford Mackinder, who proposed the Heartland theory, that whoever controls the Eurasian landmass controls the surrounding areas and hence controls the world. And then we have Mahan's theory of sea power, which describes that whoever controls the global oceans controls the world. Now, it seems that China wants to pivot back towards Mackinder's Heartland theory, because the US currently runs a system where they maintain and consolidate the power through the ocean. And also trade occurs frequently over the ocean. So through the Belt and Road Initiative, China wants to return a lot of trade to land, and this ultimately would reduce the US's power that it gains through its maritime system. In short, China doesn't need to fight for territory like Russia does when it can buy access to territory through the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, one final quick point that I want to mention about Chinese connectivity is how China and Russia are working in the Arctic to establish new trade routes. This occurs naturally through global warming as the oceans warm. It makes it easier for icebreakers to smash through the Arctic ice and establish new routes. This, although negative for the environment and most definitely needs to be addressed, allows China to establish trade routes that could be quicker to other areas. So in short, it gives them further options for their Belt and Road Initiative. Now I'm going to discuss the importance of specific entities and countries that China experiences connectivity with. And I'm going to start with BRICS. Now, BRICS was a term used by a Goldman Sachs analyst in, I believe, 2001 to describe the biggest emerging markets in the world. At the time, these countries were Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And the term has actually been used by these countries to group them together in terms of trade and having similar ideologies. Now, because of this group containing a large percentage of the world's population and countries that are big in commodities trade, Brazil are massive for food, such as soybeans and coffee. Russia, as we know, is big in the energy markets. China is big in everything, and India has the second biggest population in the world, which in time will become the biggest population in the world. Other nations want to join BRICS, which increases China's connectivity even further. Now, one key partnership within BRICS that China has is the one that it has with Russia. Now, throughout history, as we mentioned when we were discussing the history of China, sometimes their downfall comes from a lack of food or a lack of energy. Now, Russia can help China prevent this because Russia has its wheat belt and it also has a large energy market. This is one of the reasons that China benefits so much from its partnership with Russia. It can't rely too heavily on Russia, but it helps it secure access to commodities that China otherwise struggles with throughout history. Because China doesn't want to rely on Russia too much, this is why we can also see China's moves to develop ties with other countries who are big in the energy markets, such as Saudi Arabia, that Xi Jinping recently visited, Qatar, that China recently penned a 27-year natural gas contract with, and Iran. Now, the second country that I want to discuss in regards to Chinese connectivity is Japan. Now, Japan, during China's century of humiliation, was the Asian superpower. Now that China has fought this back, it's important that they keep Japanese power limited. As Chinese connectivity grows and they have problems that develop far and wide, especially outside of their own borders, they need to be able to address these. That requires having a stable regional area if they want to influence on a global level. One of the most key connectivity aspects of China's geopolitics is its relationship with Taiwan. Now, I've discussed this already, but it's an important aspect to discuss due to the US's close relationship with Taiwan. Now, the US has been fighting proxy wars since the end of World War II. That's really how it's consolidated power. Of course, it's been involved in its fair share of wars as well, Vietnam, Iraq, but especially recently, as we can see in Ukraine, as we saw in Syria, the US is fighting its wars through other countries. Now, Taiwan could be one such of those situations that the US fights through a proxy war. But I think it's a little bit different this time. Now, we saw Angela Merkel a few months ago openly come out and say that in 2014, the Minsk Accords were to buy Ukraine time to defend itself against Russia. This came after Russia's invasion of Crimea and the instability that was seen in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Now, this gave Ukraine 8 years to prepare itself for an attack that most geopoliticians thought was inevitable to happen. Now, Taiwan has been preparing to defend itself for a lot longer than 8 years. I think this makes this a tough challenge for China, especially when the US could use this as a potential proxy war to reduce Chinese power. Now, is there any other way that this could be fought rather than human based conflict? Could China grow so much in power that it can influence Taiwan in the way it wants? Could they reach a peaceful agreement? It's like with Hong Kong, how they're the same country, but they operate under different systems. That remains to be seen. I don't think you can predict that. There's too many elements to consider. So I'm not going to try to. But one of the key points regarding the close relationship between the US and Taiwan is that Taiwan is another large semiconductor producer, just like the US is. Now, China is also a large semiconductor producer, but they don't produce semiconductors to the same level of quality that Taiwan and the US do. This is why the US and Taiwan maintain quite a close relationship, but with Taiwan being so close to China's mainland, this doesn't benefit China from a geopolitical rival point of view, which is why Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan last year created such a crisis. One way that China and Taiwan are becoming more connected is through potential infrastructure projects that could connect them. This is proposed through the G3 Beijing-Taipei Expressway. This will be a bridge that would span the entire distance of the Taiwan Strait. And there's also proposed projects for a tunnel that would contain a railway that would go under the Taiwan Strait. Now, Taiwan hasn't agreed to these projects. These are currently just being built on the China side, but it will be very interesting to see how these projects develop and if they end up reaching the point where mainland China is connected to Taiwan through rail or road. So, as we get close to the end of the China geopolitical story, we have to discuss COVID. Now, China had the strictest COVID policies in the world out of any country, and most of their citizens were locked down for 3 years. Now, this has its advantages and disadvantages. One of the disadvantages, of course, is that the people there are clearly heavily controlled and surveilled, and videos came out during Chinese lockdowns that were enforced by drones and people couldn't leave their homes. We saw in the building fire a few months ago that people were locked in buildings, which, when a fire occurs, obviously is a horrendous strategy to have imposed. Another disadvantage of China locking down for so long is that their herd immunity will be quite painful. Now, we've seen in other countries that reopened a lot earlier that COVID has gone through their population and now is a lot less prevalent and a lot less of a problem because the population is naturally immune. Now, China is the biggest population in the world and it's been locked down for 3 years. When COVID gets into the population, the cases are going to rapidly accelerate and COVID will be a big problem for China. It's how it navigates the point of reaching herd immunity, and if it can reach it with as little negative impact as possible. Now, regardless of what the story is with COVID in China, it's quite possible that we won't actually know what the true story is. Chinese data is quite known to be misleading and full of misinformation, so we probably won't receive the full picture anyway. Now, I'm going to talk about advantages of COVID, which I think most people will think, are there any? It's not particularly an advantage to COVID, but China is in an advantageous position that it's seen most other nations in the world reopen. It's seen what they've done wrong, and it will hopefully be able to manage the reopening a lot better than countries who were doing it without any inspiration did. Another advantage is that, just like we saw in other countries, there was a spending boom. When governments got the printing machines rolling during COVID and handed out free money, they had nothing to spend it on because everybody was at home. China will be in the same situation, but they'll have been locked down for 3 years. So the Chinese economy could see strong growth and a large spending boom. But after that, as we saw in the developed world, came inflation. Now, this wasn't just caused by COVID, this was also caused by supply chain problems and the Ukraine war. But it will be interesting to see if China can manage this situation and avoid inflation. Now, because China is a key commodity player, they probably won't suffer supply chain inflation as heavily as other places would, who aren't as self-sufficient or don't have as much access to commodities as China does. It interests me if trade between the US and China stopped completely, how self-sufficient China is, or if that's what their aim is by having access to large amounts of commodities. On the profile for China in the Geopolitics Explained database, I include a lot of data below the report, any blogs where I talk about China, and then this podcast episode itself. Below that in the data section, I'm going to explore this, so for anybody who's interested, you can go to geopoliticsexplained.co.uk, head into the Geopolitics database, into China's page, and down at the bottom you should see data referring to this topic and if China is self-sufficient in any key commodities that it needs access to for its economy to function and grow at the levels that it does and has for many years. So, finally, just like in episode 1, how we discussed Russia and how it interacts with itself, I'm going to do the same with China. Now, China, we saw a few weeks ago, published a document that stated that its population declined by 850,000 people last year. Now, due to the one-child policy, China has one of the worst aging populations in the world. This puts strain on a country financially, as it has to support a larger aging population, but it also puts strain on the citizens of a country. One working adult in China might have to support 2 parents and 4 grandparents, depending on the family, of course, but that is quite a strain financially on citizens of China, and it was caused by the one-child policy. An aging population could also lead to China struggling to maintain the levels of growth that it has for so many years in its economy. The Chinese one-child policy was an attempt to control population growth, which was rapid in China. The policy existed during the period between 1980 and 2015, and it helped to reduce population growth, but it contributed to the population decline that we're now seeing. It contributed to an aging population, and it also contributed to quite a skew in the population. Families preferred male babies who would work and provide for the family. This led to high abortion rates for female babies, which is why a population skew now exists. There is more men than women in China, specifically in the age groups that were born between 1980 and 2015, when the Chinese one-child policy was active. Another aspect of the Chinese population is how many people leave China. Now, China maintains an authoritarian approach to society, and this society is highly surveilled and controlled. Now, if China wants to be able to continue to grow its economy at high levels of growth, it needs to be keeping this young population who will be well educated and can innovate China's economy to bring about that growth that it desires. But if these people see better lives for themselves in other countries, lives with more freedom, then they will leave China unless incentive is provided for them to stay. Now, another element of China interacting with itself is its internal politics. As I discussed earlier, we've seen Xi Jinping consolidate his power as he enters his third term. As China has geopolitical goals on a global scale, as it spreads influence through trade, Belt and Road Initiative, BRICS, and countless other aspects, could the fact that Xi Jinping has consolidated power and it has no challenges lead to Chinese internal politics suffering? We saw protests when bank runs occurred in China during the last year. Could we see more protests specifically related to Chinese internal politics? And even if we did see these protests, would we find out about them, as media coming out of China is fairly controlled? This is a question worth considering, but like I said, with Xi Jinping consolidating power and having no challenges, even if the internal politics of China was to be challenged, I don't think any massive change would occur. Okay, that is everything that I want to discuss about China. So I'll wrap things up. Now, Chinese connectivity is growing. They're distancing from the US, but they're growing closer to pretty much everybody else. If China can manage its own demographics, if they remain a strong player in the commodities market, and if they maintain valuable partnerships with countries who supply them with things that they often struggle with, such as food and energy, then China will remain a global power and continue to challenge the US. So much of this story is still untold, and it's very unpredictable, but China still remains one of the key geopolitical players in the world. And when we look back upon this period in hindsight, they will be one of the biggest characters in the story. I apologise for the fact that I've spoke for an hour and 6 minutes before editing this down. I really hope that when I edit it down, it isn't this long. But if you do listen to all of it, thank you very much. Maybe you could do it while you go for a walk or while you're at the gym. That's how I'd listen if I was to listen to the sound of my own voice, which I don't. thank you to anyone who listened to episode 1 about Russia. I really appreciate it. If anybody has got any feedback, I would love it. Whether it's positive or criticism, I'd love to be able to improve this so I can put out as much good, useful information as possible. I know that there will be aspects of history and geopolitics about these countries that I forget to discuss or that I don't know about. If I miss out any aspects that you think are key aspects, again, let me know. But my plan with these podcasts is to release them with the information that I know now in my brain, and then over time I will add to these episodes once I know more, once stories in geopolitics develop. So this is where my brain is currently with explaining these stories, but over time I'm hoping to improve these podcasts and specifically the database of geopolitical information that I'm collecting more and more. So hopefully over time they become even more valuable. Okay, if you want to find the rest of my work, I write blogs twice a week on Substack or Medium. You can find me at Geopolitics Explained on these sites. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube at GeopoliticsEXP. Or you can find me on my website at geopoliticsexplained.co.uk. Thank you for listening to this very long episode. I hope I provided even one useful thing for one person. If I did, that's great. We will be back soon for episode 3. I'm leaning towards discussing either the US or the UK, but that's not fully set in stone. So I will see how I'm feeling. Thank you again. This is Dylan, signing off. This podcast is for informational purposes only. Any financial market talk is not to be taken as investment, personal, or legal advice, or recommendations. We make every effort to be accurate, but information conveyed could contain errors or become outdated. Consult a qualified finance professional before any decisions you make in the financial markets and do your own due diligence. My geopolitical analysis is based on data and prediction. Please don't interpret it as total truth.